Welcome. Let us take a journey back to 1916. During this time, we are in the midst of World War I. We will be talking about trench warfare and what it was like to be there. Trench warfare lasted from 1914 all the way to 1919. And on one side you have the Germans, and on the other side you would have the French and the British. And in the middle was no man's land. And how trench warfare worked was one side, let's just say the Germans, would charge over to the British and French side and take over the first part of the trench. And then in return, the Germans would fight back and take back the trench. And they would just do this big game of tug of war. And it was an inch by inch war. And they called it kind of like an inch by inch war. So some things that you would have in the trench would be, you'd have just a standard army shovel. And this army shovel wasn't really important, but the trench shovel was used to build the trenches and also to bury the dead bodies of the soldiers and friends that they had. You'd also have an anti-mosquito clothing because in some parts of the trenches there's more moist and there were more mosquitoes, and this was a way to help kind of protect them from the mosquitoes. And during this time people smoked a lot, and they would have almost every soldier would have a cigarette tin. And if they weren't a smoker, then they would put other things in the tin. And when you think about the things that they might have ate, there was one thing that the people in the trenches ate, and they were called army biscuits. Yum. Well, so the army biscuits are actually very famous for being very crunchy, very hard, very tough, and even crumbled into pieces. Soldiers would mix the army biscuit into either water or all sorts of different things just to make it edible for them or even enjoyable for some. And another thing that you would have is a camouflage helmet. And then the last thing I want to talk about is diaries. The soldiers were not allowed to have diaries because if they fell into the enemy hands, then they could be used against them. And they weren't allowed to have diaries for that reason. So the trenches weren't that deep. The trenches was about 7 feet deep, and they spread for miles. As well as the width of the trench, you could maybe fit 2 soldiers side by side, and just enough room for them to get pushed by. So the German trenches actually were a lot nicer than the French and British. The Germans made sure that the trenches were nice. The Germans wanted to make sure that they were built in good places where there wasn't much moisture or wasn't much water. As well as some of the bunkers had electricity and even running water. The French and the British, on the other hand, thought that the trench war was going to end very soon. So they did not worry much about where they were going to lay the trenches. So they would just dig the trenches where they felt, and that led to having very muddy and wet. In some places you'd have water up to your knees, hips, and even waist. And if your trench did have a toilet, which many of you did, then it would be not uncommon for it to be overfilled and just not really usable. And trenches were housed many diseases, and with the many diseases they've gone through and killed many soldiers. And also in the trenches you would have a lot of dead bodies, and there's not many places you can put the dead bodies during the trench warfare, so they'd either put them in the walls of the trench or just left them on the ground. And with that, it also caused a big issue of rats. In the trenches it was not uncommon to have a lot of rats just running around, and there were so many rats that they couldn't kill them fast enough. And the trenches also became just a trash zone. They would put anything that's disposable would be in a trench. So you might have broken cartridges, you might have torn uniforms, shattered helmets, even bodies just there, because they didn't really have places to put the stuff. So some of the sicknesses that came from the trenches was, if you got a cut, you would get an infection. And many times people would get pneumonia from the cuts because they cannot get it cleaned and they cannot get it like healed fast enough. And because the trenches were muddy and just wet, it made infection rates even higher. Trench fever was is a sickness that people would get in the trenches, and people who had trench fevers will have high headaches, high fever, severe headaches. They would have like tenderness and they would be very weak. They'd also have a lot of abdominal pain due to the trench fever. And then trench feet. Trench feet was also not uncommon. Trench feet was due to the moisture in the trenches. So trenches were dug either at or below sea level, as well as right under the surface there was just moisture. So the moisture would be in the boots, and they would give them trench feet. And with trench feet, it makes your feet very painful. It makes your feet it makes them swell and make them numb. And if untreated, people could lose a foot due to trench feet. And then soldiers were very deprived of sleep. Soldiers were worried about they're going to get attacked. Soldiers believed that at any moment they can be attacked, so that not many of them actually got a lot of sleep. And a war or another fight could break out within minutes, so a soldier needs to be ready and prepared to get ready to fight back. And that made them more scared and made it hard for them to sleep or to relax. And then with war, there comes mental problems. A lot of soldiers would have had mental problems due to what they've seen, due to what's happened. Even if they got hurt or when somebody got hurt, they could cause mental problems. So now let's talk about just a normal day, or a normal-ish day for somebody in a trench. So at 5 a.m. it's called stand to arm. And this is the time where everyone was up and ready. Everyone was watching the other side, making sure no one's coming over. And they were getting ready just in case they were going to war. As well, they would use this time sometimes to plan an attack or attack the other side. So then around 7 a.m. you'd have your breakfast, which you'd get to eat that famous army biscuit. And you'd also sometimes have tea. So this is the time where you got to eat. And then 8 a.m. you would do your cleaning your weapons, you're getting the trench tidy-ish. And then at noon, you'd have dinner. Again, you get to eat the famous army biscuit. And then 5 p.m. you'll have tea. And then 6:30, you'll have a stand where it's again, they're getting ready to either get invaded or they're getting ready to invade. And then at 6:30, they would have this time where it's night. So they would some of them might rest. And then a lot of them actually are patrolling, they're digging more trenches, they're putting in more barbed wire and getting more defenses set up just in case in the morning the other side decides to invade. So now let's really talk about what the soldiers thought during this time. A young lieutenant writes to his mother saying, "I haven't been killed yet, but it's a matter of time." Soldiers believed at this time that they were not going to make it. They believed that they were going to die in the trenches. And a common attitude that they had was, we're going to die. Not many people actually got out of the trench warfare unharmed. And also, a surprising fact about the trenches is it's really boring. You're either sitting, cleaning your tools, or being scared of what's coming. So it was a very boring kind of time. A letter from Private Stanley Terry of the 15th North End East Garrison wrote a letter to his family in November 1915. "We have just come out of the trenches after being in for 6 days, and up to our waist in waters. While we were in the trenches, one of the Germans came over to our trench for a cigarette, and then back again. And he was not fired at. we and the Germans started walking about in the open between between the two trenches, repairing them, and there was no firing at all. I think we're all getting fed up with it. Soldiers on both sides didn't really want to be there towards the end. It was boring, again, like they were just sitting there. It was a stalemate. Even if like one side takes over one side's trench, they just know that they're going to get taken over and they're going to get pushed back. So it's, again, an inch by inch war. You're not getting much ground with the trenches. And the trench, in no man land, you'd have people shooting, bombarding it. You'd have people shooting, and it just wasn't safe. And then another letter from Richard Frederick Hall writes, Dear Garland, many thanks for the letter, which was somewhat a surprise to me. No news was quite fresh, as I do not hear from anybody in the office. We have just come out from the trenches where we were for 7 days and had a most awful time. We were 3 days in the res and put in the firing lines where we took part in an attack. And we were also under a heavy bombardment. I'm saying sorry to say we had many casualties. 35 killed and 138 wounded. And I can assure you, it was an experience I shall never forget. Anyhow, Williams, Kimball, and myself came out safely. Again, this was a dangerous place to be. And the trenches weren't safe. Many people lost their lives, and many people got sick. And if we were to live in the trenches now, I don't think many of us would actually survive in the trenches. But this is what it would have been like to live in the trenches. You would have probably got shot, you would have gotten sick, and you would have probably came out with a mental problem. And this was what the trench warfare was like.